Guys, we are going to have a virtual lesson today on Kate Chopin and these first few chapters in The Awakening. So take notes as you would if you were in class, pay attention. This information was fair game for your quiz on Thursday. All right, so Kate Chopin, she lived from 1850 to 1904, and she grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. So grew up in the South. Um, Amidst the turmoil of the Civil War, post-Civil War. And her father died when she was very young, and so she was raised by her mother and grandmother. And in fact, that had a huge influence on her. Her grandmother was a very strong willed, independent woman and a firm believer in the education of women and of women refining their intellect and using it. So we can see that in Chopin's position as one of the early feminists in American literature. And we are, in fact, reading one of the first feminist novels in American literature, in The Awakening. So she was well educated, which was very unusual for a woman of this time period, particularly, they didn't have a lot of money. They had some, but they prioritized education, whereas some other families might have put that money elsewhere. But her family grew up valuing that. She was married young at the age of 19, had 6 children, and shortly after, she had those children in quick succession, her husband, and at this point they were living in New Orleans, right? And her husband was successful. He had some business problems, didn't make a ton of money, to the point that when when her husband died, her children were still very young, and her mother had also recently died. She had to find a way to earn her own living. She did not have enough money to just exist as a young widow with 6 young children. So she decided to become an author. She said, there's a market for fiction of local color, and I have all this experience in New Orleans of the Creole, the Cajun culture. We'll talk a little bit about that. So that's what she decided to do. And a couple other little things that really aren't in your bio is that Kate Chopin was known for a bit of impropriety. She would, in this time period, a woman shouldn't be out by herself at certain hours. And she just really didn't care about any of that. She didn't care about being accepted by society. So she just kind of did her own thing. And we see a lot of that in the protagonist, Edna, coming through, that kind of rebellious spirit. All right, so let's talk a little bit about The Awakening. This is her most well-known work of fiction. She did write some other, quite a bit of short fiction. This was published in 1899, and it was not well received at the time. People thought The Awakening was, in one article I read, they used the term obscene, which is kind of funny to us here in our postmodern times, because you're going to read the chapters that allude to extramarital sex, and you might not even catch that it happened. But in this time period, it was considered very risque, very scandalous. So she didn't really do very well with it. And then, interestingly enough, this work was rediscovered in the 60s and 70s. There was somewhat of a revival in not just The Awakening, but of all her fiction. And this is when she really came to be known as someone who should be studying in American literature, which makes sense if you know anything about our American culture in the 60s and 70s. There was a huge emphasis on freedom and knowing yourself and being in touch with all your senses. And so some of the more sensual aspects of The Awakening were very appealing to that generation. So, and now we study it as, I'm sure some of you may have read it in high school. It is considered a very significant work in American literature. All right, so let's start with the setting. Now, this story is set in New Orleans, specifically on the Grand Isle, which is an island, hence the name, right off the coast of New Orleans. And so what the Grand Isle was, it was all these wealthier families, it was their summer home, all right? So they lived in the city during the year, and during the summer, the families would go to their vacation home on this little island. It was like a little resort. It was family owned, And many of the men would still, they would take the ferry, the boat back into work during the week and then come back out to join their wives and children on the weekend. So this is where we have the beginning of our story set. And we also see the influence of Creole culture. Now, all that Creole means, that's a reference to the French and Spanish descendants that settled in this Louisiana southern area, which, if you know your American history, you know that about the Louisiana Purchase, and that was originally owned by the French. So this makes sense. So this culture, we see a majority of Catholic beliefs there. So that is very important because our main character, Edna, she grew up in a more Protestant, Presbyterian background, and so she is somewhat displaced among these Creoles and just different beliefs. They're also much more open-minded and warm. There's a very huge emphasis in Creole culture on family. They're incredibly relational. And by open-minded, I mean they're a little more liberal in just the way they operate from day to day. Like in the opening chapters, there's this scene where Edna and Robert and Adele are talking, and they reference the fact that Adele is pregnant. And Edna, her upbringing was that it was improper to allude to a woman being pregnant, which you may be asked, like, well, why is that? Well, because that would, in fact, allude to the fact that two people had sex to create a baby. So it was considered improper. But in the Creole culture, they were a little more relaxed about those things. It wasn't considered offensive. It wasn't considered improper. But all this is very important, particularly to the development of Edna as a character, as she came from this kind of stuffy, conservative background. And then she finds herself dropped into this very different world, and she's not really sure what to do with that. Okay, so that's our setting. And then next we're going to talk about the characters. And here's where we're going to dive a little bit more deeply. I'm going to pull some quotes out of your book. Now I have to tell you, I do not have my most recent edition of the book at home with me as I'm making this video, so I had to use an older edition. So instead of page numbers, I'm just going to refer to the chapter numbers, and so that'll just have to be enough to help you get to where you need to go. The good news is, because it's a video, you can pause it and find where I am and mark the quotes. I do encourage you to mark some of these key quotes in your book, or at least take note of what page number they're on, because you are going to need to write about this. You do have a writing assignment, so you want to be able to reference some of these key quotations. All right. So with the characters, I'm just going to pop a name up here, and then, again, you're going to need to fill in your notes. I'm not giving you a ton of information on the PowerPoint. It's going to be more the audio that you're going to want to write some of this stuff down. So our protagonist is Edna Pontellier, and that's the best way I know how to pronounce the French name. I think that's right. Okay. So what we know about Edna is that she is a young woman. She's in her mid to late 20s. I believe 26 is her age. And like I said before, she's a little bit lost in this world. She's not very well connected to her husband. You can tell right from the get-go that their marriage is not awesome. They don't have very good communication at all. But I want to pull out a couple key quotes about Edna. The first one is in chapter 7. All right, so if you can find chapter 7 at the very beginning, and this is a really important quote, so you definitely want to mark this one down. So the very first paragraph of chapter 7 reads, Mrs. Pontellier was not a woman given to confidences, a characteristic hitherto contrary to her nature. Even as a child, she had lived her own small life, all within herself. At a very early period, she had apprehended instinctively the dual life, the outward existence which conforms, the inward life which questions. Okay, so let me just talk about this a little bit. And I hope you understand the use of the word confidences in that first sentence. That just means sharing. She's not given to confiding in others. She's a very private person. So here is Edna's primary conflict, and her primary conflict is actually within herself. So this dual existence, the outward existence which conforms, the inward life which questions, that is her deal. Like, that is the question of the whole book. Do I conform to this outward existence that is expected of me, of being a wife and a mother and doing what I'm supposed to do in this particular society? Or do I listen to that inner questioning voice saying, like, what? I don't even really want this. What do I want in my life? I want something different. Whatever it is, it's not this. She is not content in her role as a wife and mother. She feels very, that her soul is not suited to that she's meant for something different. And I hope that that resonates with you, because as college students, many of you are in the same boat. Like, why am I at college? Am I just conforming to what my parents expect, what society expects me to go to college and get a degree? But then you have those moments on your own where you're like, what am I doing? Like, I don't even like this. I don't even want to do this. And so you're trying to figure out that balance between listening to those, what you want on the inside versus the expectations of society. So mark that down, a really important quote. We're going to come back to it multiple times. But that is Edna's her primary conflict in her character. All right, and then if you turn the page to a little later in chapter 7, it talks about her marriage to her husband, to Leonce. And this is really important to understand why they got married or how they got married. So look at page 575. Oh, sorry, it's in the old edition. So it's about a page or so before the end of chapter 7. So it talks about their marriage. It says, her marriage to Leonce Pontellier was purely an accident, in this respect resembling many other marriages which masquerade as the decrees of fate. It was in the midst of her secret great passion that she met him, so this other crush she had. He fell in love, as men are in the habit of doing, and pressed his suit with an earnestness and an ardor which left nothing to be desired. He pleased her. His absolute devotion flattered her. She fancied there was a sympathy of thought and taste between them, in which fancy she was mistaken. Add to this the violent opposition of her father and her sister Margaret to the marriage with a Catholic, and we need seek no further for the motives which led her to accept Monsieur Pontellier for her husband. So why did she get married? She really just got married to spite her family because she wanted to get out of there. She wanted to get out of Dodge. And this guy seemed to like her. She kind of thought they got along. So she said, done. You are my ticket out of home. Now, you guys all know that's a terrible reason to marry someone. But that is why they got married. Which leads us to discussing his character. And he is significantly older than her. In fact, I believe he's 40. I could be wrong on that, but significantly older. But to learn a little bit more about him, we actually need to turn back towards the beginning of the book. So go back to chapter 1, actually. This is about a page and a half into chapter 1. And here at the very beginning of the book, she's been out in the ocean, with her friend Robert. We'll get to him here in a minute. But she and Robert have been, sunbathing out by the ocean, and he's just chilling out on the front porch. And so they approach the house. So the first words out of his mouth to his wife, listen to this. First words we hear from Leonce. You are burnt beyond recognition, he added, looking at his wife as one looks at a valuable piece of personal property which has suffered some damage. Okay, so when they approach, he's like, you guys are foolish to go out, you're out in the middle of the day in the heat. And he looks at her like a valuable piece of personal property. What does that tell you about his character? Is he truly in love with her, or does he view her as a possession? It really seems that he is more on the possessive side of things as far as his wife goes. And he also, his deal with Edna, the reason he gets upset with her, is that he just feels like she doesn't do what she's supposed to do. So if you turn over to chapter 3, it talks about this. So that evening, they're talking about their, different stuff and, their son who might be sick and all those things. So if you look at the second paragraph in chapter 3, it says that Leonce, he thought it very discouraging that his wife, who was the sole object of his existence, evinced so little interest in things which concerned him and valued so little his conversation. So he's like, man, she just doesn't pay attention to me. She doesn't seem interested in what I'm interested in. And then if you go down a few paragraphs, again, they're worried the one son has a fever or something. And it says that he reproached his wife with her inattention, her habitual neglect of the children. If it was not a mother's place to look after her children, whose on earth was it? And so he gets very upset if she, he thinks she's not taking care of the kids as she should. And it's a very interesting tension in the book because she's not a great mom. She doesn't seem to care about her kids that much. So in that way, we can kind of feel his frustration. We're like, yeah, that's kind of weird. She doesn't seem to care about her kids that much. But we also can feel her frustration in that she feels that motherhood was like thrust upon her and she didn't have a choice in it. So that is, it's a significant tension in the book. All right, so we have Edna, who has this inner conflict. Her husband, who he's a little bit more shallow character. He's driven by what he wants. We'll find out later he's also driven by social appearances. He really wants to keep up his place in the society. And so then now we have our love triangle. Enter Robert Lebrun. And so Robert, he's just kind of this young guy. He's unmarried. And he is just kind of like the resident flirt on the island here. So he's the guy who your book says, if you look in chapter 5, in fact, let's read a little bit. So if you go to chapter 5, second paragraph, he, Robert, had lived in her shadow during the past month. No one thought anything of it. Many had predicted that Robert would devote himself to Mrs. Pontellier when he arrived. Since the age of 15, which was 11 years before, Robert each summer at Grand Isle had constituted himself the devoted attendant of some fair dame or damsel. Sometimes it was a young girl, again a widow, but as often as not it was some interesting married woman. So apparently this is like his deal, that he just like, there's a woman every summer that he's like, oh, I'm just going to be your shadow and follow you around and flirt with you. And you have to think, like, that might seem a little odd to us, but in the Creole culture, divorce was incredibly uncommon because people were so dedicated to their families. So Robert was seen as just this harmless flirt. Like, nobody really felt threatened by him. He was just like a kid who just kind of, he always was somebody's puppy following them around. And so this year it was Edna, and he decides to follow her around. The problem with this is, though, does Edna understand this Creole culture? No. And so here we have the setup for some further conflict, miscommunications, misunderstandings, some other confusing things going on as far as different love interests in the novel. So Robert, he's just kind of always there, hanging out, flirting with Edna. Our next main character we need to discuss is Edna's best friend, Adele. I'm going to do my best with the name here, Ratignolle. I don't know if that's correct, but I think that, from what I know of French, that's how you would say it. We'll just call her Adele. So Adele is Edna's best friend on the island. She's also married. She has many children. And she is what we call a foil character. And all that means is that she is the opposite of Edna. And her character exists to highlight certain things about Edna. And if you look at the end of, let's see, that's the beginning of chapter 4. So go back a page. It's like the third paragraph in chapter 4. And we learn a little bit about Adele. So here it's talking about how Mrs. Pontellier was not a mother woman. The mother women seemed to prevail that summer at Grand Isle. It was easy to know them, fluttering about with extended protecting wings when any harm, real or imagined, threatened their precious brood. They were women who idolized their children, worshipped their husband, and esteemed it a holy privilege to efface themselves as individuals and grow wings as ministering angels. Many of them were delicious in the role. One of them was the embodiment of every womanly grace and charm. If her husband did not adore her, he was a brute, deserving of death by slow torture. Her name was Adele Ratignolle. So she is like the epitome of the perfect wife and mother. And it's almost like a little sickening to read that, and I don't know, maybe I'm too much of a feminist, but it is a beautiful thing to be a wife and mother. Don't get me wrong. I'm married. I love being a wife. I would love to be a mother someday. But, that's her whole identity. Her whole calling in life is to be a wife and mother. And so Adele is that woman. She lives for her children. She lives for her husband, and which is the exact opposite of Edna, who just feels like I feel very empty in that role. And so it's very interesting that they're friends and that she is one of the few people that Edna will open up to. And we'll see that develop some. Okay, one final character, and I'm not going to say a whole lot about her, but I do want you to have her in the list of important characters here at the beginning, is Mademoiselle Rise. And she is an older single lady. We know she's a pianist. She's an artist in that way. And she comes into play later in the novel. But it is interesting that between Edna and Adele and Mademoiselle Rise, we have these three female characters who are all incredibly different. And we'll talk about that progression. But Mademoiselle Rise, she's kind of a loner. Has never been married as an older woman and just kind of does her own thing. Plays her piano, lives on her own, and that's what she does. Okay, so those are our main cast of characters, and I do want to talk briefly about the significant events that happen in these first 12 chapters. There are 3 events we're going to discuss. So, a lot of these first 12 chapters, and I know I warned you guys that it starts a little slow, is just kind of setting the stage here, but there are a few important things. The first one is chapter 6. We have the significance of the ocean. And this is a very short chapter, just a few paragraphs. And the description of the ocean here is really important. And we'll talk more later about the symbolism. What does the ocean symbolize? And all that. So let's look at this chapter. And it says, Edna Pontellier could not have told why, wishing to go to the beach with Robert, she should have in the first place declined, and in the second place have followed in obedience to one of the 2 contradictory impulses which impelled her. So remember that dual existence, outward conformity, inward questioning? So that is associated with the ocean. She's like, oh, I'm not going to go to the ocean. Yes, I am going to go to the ocean. So they go to the ocean, and it gives this description, and it talks about how she's beginning to find her place in the universe. Look towards the end of the chapter, and it says, the voice of the sea is seductive, never ceasing, whispering, clamoring, murmuring, inviting the soul to wander for a spell in abysses of solitude, to lose itself in mazes of inward contemplation. The voice of the sea speaks to the soul. The touch of the sea is sensuous, enfolding the body in its soft, close embrace. All right, so this idea of inviting the soul and speaking to the soul is connected with the ocean. And when you think soul, you think of like identity. Who is my inner person? And so here we have Edna associating with the ocean with her exploration of identity. Who am I going to be? What do I want to be? Who am I really? And so this idea of exploration, introverted, contemplation, we associate with the ocean. And this comes up over and over again. Which leads us to the next significant event, which is in chapter 10, which is where Edna finally learns to swim. And this is interesting in that she's been trying all summer to learn how to swim, and everyone tries to teach her, even children try to teach her how to swim, and she just can't do it. She just freaks out. She's scared. And so every time, she would get in the ocean and get out past where she could touch, she would just, freak out. And so this night, they all decide, a big group of them, like, oh, let's go out for a nighttime swim. So they go out there, And she has this moment where she finally learns to swim. All right, so I'm about a page into chapter 10, and it says, all right, so she did shout for joy as with a sweeping stroke or two she lifted her body to the surface of the water. A feeling of exultation overtook her, as if some power of significant import had been given her soul. There's her soul again. She grew daring and reckless, overestimating her strength. She wanted to swim far out where no woman had swum before. So she has this moment where she feels independent. She feels empowered. She wants to go further out in the ocean. And of course, everyone's like, yay, look at you, you learned how to swim. Skip a few lines, and it says that intoxicated with her newly conquered power, she swam out alone. She turned her face seaward to gather an impression of space and solitude, which the vast expanse of water, meeting and melting with the moonlit sky, conveyed to her excited fancy. As she swam, she seemed to be reaching out for the unlimited in which to lose herself. All right, so again, we associate the ocean and learning to swim with this experience of being alone, of independence. We see words like alone and solitude, and also this kind of empowerment, right? She feels free. However, what happens next? So she gets out there, and then she does have like a freak out moment. It says, a quick vision of death smote her soul, and for a second of time appalled and enfeebled her senses. But by an effort, she rallied her staggering faculties and managed to regain the land. So she gets out there, and then she gets scared, and she comes back. And here's what's sad is she tells her husband, she's like, oh man, I got so far out, I thought I was going to die. And how does he respond? He says, oh, you weren't that far. I was watching you. So she just had this like moment in her life of empowerment, all the feels. And he's like, oh, that really wasn't a big deal. He is very quick to belittle her feelings and to downplay them. And so anyway, this is really significant because this is one of Edna's first steps towards her search for identity, her search for freedom and empowerment. But it's complicated. It's scary. It's dangerous. And all this will continue to make sense as we go throughout the novel and you see the plot unfold. All right, final significant event, chapter 11, the defiance of her husband, of Léonce. So after the evening swim, Edna goes back out to the house, and she's just like chilling on. She gets a blanket or whatever and hangs out in the hammock on the front porch. And so he gets home, and this is very subtle. You may not have caught it when you read it, but all right. So this is chapter 11, about 5 lines in. Do you know it's past 1 o'clock? Come on. So this is Léonce, and he mounted the steps and went into the room. Edna, called Mr. Pontellier from within, after a few moments had gone by. Don't wait for me, she answered. He thrust his head through the door. You will take cold out there, he said irritably. What folly is this? Why don't you come in? So here's what's between the lines, y'all, is he wants her to come in to perform her wifely duties. All right, he's like, you need to come in and go to bed because that's what his desire is, to have sex, to have marital relations, and she is defying him in this moment. And look, and you might be like, what? You're reading between the lines. Look a few more lines down. They talk about the mosquitoes. Listen to this. She heard him moving about the room, every sound indicating impatience and irritation. Another time she would have gone in at his request. She would, through habit, have yielded to his desire, not with any sense of submission or obedience to his compelling wishes, but unthinkingly, as we walk, move, sit, stand, go through the daily treadmill of the life which has been portioned out to us. So this idea of his desire, his compelling wishes, like if he just wanted to go to sleep, he'd go to sleep, right? He wouldn't care. So again, reading between the lines, he wants her to come in and to submit to his sexual desires. And it says normally she would have, but for some reason, and I love Chopin's description, she has such a way of words, the daily treadmill of life. Edna decides to step off that treadmill and to do something different. She says, no, I'm not going to come in just because you want me to. I'm going to sit out here on the porch. And so here's what's interesting though, and to me this is actually kind of humorous. He's so cranky about it, he goes out and sits on the porch. Like, they fight about it a little more, and he just sits out there and smokes, and they're out there all night long. Talk about awkward. He's like, fine, if you're not going to come in, then I'm going to come out and sit on the porch. And to me, that just reinforces this idea of he's kind of possessive and controlling. So they sit out there all night long, both very stubborn, until morning. And so that is kind of a awkward moment there, but it's another step in Edna, her self-realization of, her exploring, not just submitting to other people's wishes, but, what do I want? What is my role in the world? And so here, and again, I hope you can see these feminist ideas coming through in the character of Edna. Okay, so that's really all I have to say about these first 12 chapters. Something, you guys think through this as you read the next section in preparation for Thursday's quiz. Something I do really want us to talk about on Thursday is, how do you feel about Edna? Do you like her? Do you hate her? Do you feel sympathy towards her? Are you frustrated with her? Do you think she's just kind of whiny? Everyone has a different reaction to her as a character and whether or not they feel drawn to her or repulsed by her. And she's definitely that kind of character that you have to have some kind of reaction to. You can't just leave her there. So I hope all that made sense, and let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you Thursday.